Alrighty guys, how's it going? We are going to go over our first stage of FSA prep, the one that we did on Friday, this past Friday, okay? So we're going to start off by talking about thesis statements, about body idea generation, right? Body paragraphs, how do you get your main points from that? We're going to talk about introductions, number 3, and we're going to talk about conclusions, okay? I'll try to get through it as quick as I can so you could go about your day, but we have to start with the basics. So, thesis statements, what are they? We've been going over thesis statements pretty much the entire year. We went over argument at the beginning of the year, we've continued on through, but it bears repeating, always. A thesis statement is your main idea. It is whatever your main point is throughout an entire essay. So, we call that a thesis, we call it an argument, we call it a controlling idea, is what the technical term is that the graders are going to use. Okay, they want to know that you have a consistent controlling idea throughout your essay. They're going to look for your thesis before anything else. So it's important that we get that done first. Whenever you approach a prompt, every time you approach a prompt, you should first make sure that you know what your thesis is going to be. You answer that before anything else, and then you can move on and do the rest of the essay. So, how do we get a thesis statement? It's easier than it sounds, okay? A thesis statement is always going to be the one-sentence answer to your prompt, okay? So your thesis, it's a one-sentence answer to your prompt. That's it. No ifs, ands, or buts, okay? I'll be moving off to the side occasionally so that you guys can see the board, see what I've written, okay? But that's it. If you can answer your prompt in one sentence, that's your thesis. So, what does that look like? Say we have a thesis statement for a prompt about freedom versus safety. That's one that we've done as a timed writing. I believe it was the first timed writing we did this quarter. So, our first timed writing says, would you rather be safe or would you rather be free? Right, it says to respond to a statement by a certain novelist, I think, and the person says that the average man would rather be safe than free. And then you have to defend, agree with, or challenge this statement, right? Whether you'd rather be safe or you'd rather be free. Now, how do we answer that? Well, obviously there's going to be a couple possibilities. Either one, we agree with the safety, or two, we agree with freedom. We think freedom is more important. Or we think there's somewhere in between, a third option. We call that qualifying, okay? So your answer is going to be one of the three. You need to pick one of the three. You either do one, the other, or somewhere in between the two. In this case, I'm going to make it really easy. I'm going to say that freedom is more important. So, if I know I'm going to talk about freedom, I then can write a sentence about that. I can write, let's say, it is not true that safety is preferable to freedom. And then I have a couple options. I can put my 3 body paragraphs in that. I could say because, and then give my 1, 2, and 3. Right? My 3 body paragraph ideas. Or I can just say, it is not true that safety is preferable to freedom, period. When I was in school, I always had a teacher that said that you had to include your 3 body paragraphs in your thesis. That's not true, okay? If you do that, then every thesis is going to look completely identical. It's going to be really annoying to try and shove everything into your thesis statement, especially if your thesis statement ends up getting really more complicated, right? If you have a complicated thesis, a complicated main idea, or if you have complicated body paragraphs, Why do we have to put everything into the thesis statement? We don't. What I recommend, though, is that you put your 3 main body paragraphs either right before or right after your thesis statement, preferably before. Okay? Lead into your thesis statement by giving the different qualifications to it, giving all the different details surrounding it. So, if I have my 3 purposes here, or my 3 body paragraphs here, right? I say that safety is not preferable to freedom. Freedom's more important. I might say, number 1, okay? My first idea might be government, right? Use the US as an example, okay? That's number 1. I might say that the United States was founded on the principle of freedom, and therefore, because it was founded on the principle of freedom and the United States has been successful thus far, freedom is preferable to safety. I then might talk about my crush, right? I might talk about relationships. And how freedom in this case versus safety, it's very safe to not ask out your crush. It's very safe to not ask them to the dance, not ask them out, something like that. And it's very safe to sit where you are and be alone, right? But if you embrace that freedom to make the choice of who you love and who you want to, and who you choose to love, as long as it's consensual and they love you too, right? You can get a lot of freedom that way. You can get a lot of personal freedom to do what you want and do and be with who you want, okay? That could be one there. And let's say I come up with a third reason. Let's see. Third reason, freedom versus safety. I might talk about the opposite. I might say why freedom is a bad thing. I might put a counterclaim, okay? Let's say I say a counter, a time where safety and the preference of safety was a bad thing and should not have come before freedom. Let me think of a good example. So, needing to have where they had safety and did not have freedom. We could say, I'm trying to think of a good example. People signing away their rights.
Prison.
Right, prison would be a very good example. Right? You have safety in prison. Right? You, in theory, are very safe when you're in a prison. You sign away your rights, you go to this prison, you live there, right? Granted, you're in there for a good reason most of the time. But if you're in the prison, you give up that freedom, but is it better? No, you don't have your freedom, right? You don't have it, you don't have the ability to choose what you want to do. Therefore, that would be a good example of how safety, right, in prison is not preferable to freedom outside of it, okay? Now, this is just a hypothetical. It's always a good idea to come up with your body paragraphs from whatever your thesis statement is. Coming up with examples, one of the hardest things you can do in an essay. So what I like to do is kind of move on into introductions, because this will kind of help contextualize how we create our introductions, and it'll contextualize how we come up with body paragraphs, okay? So, when we want to create an introduction for whatever it happens to be, all right, creating an introduction is a lot easier than it sounds. I like to use this policy of 3-2-1, okay? Now this 3-2-1 works for any introduction you're ever going to see. You can always do it in this order. I'm actually going to move it over a little bit. You guys can see it a little easier. Okay. The first step of this, 3-2-1. Let me double check that you can see it. You should be able to, yes. Okay. The first step of this 3-2-1 is you write your thesis. Kind of unsurprising, right? Of course, you're going to write your thesis first. First thing you do when you see a prompt, you write your thesis. And then you need to give a little bit of background information. Do you have anything that you can add to kind of sort of give more information about your thesis? Let's say I choose a thesis about, Let's say I choose a thesis about wearing masks. Once again, right? We should wear masks. I need to give some information about that. I need to create some details. That's step 2. Give some details about wearing masks, some information about it. In this case, we're looking for information that could probably be used in a body paragraph, right? What are some things we use masks for? Right? There's only one thing that you can take and give details about in the sentence. We should wear. No word in there has anything to do with any sort of detail, but masks, you can take a lot of detail from. So let's look at it. Maybe you talk about fashion. Maybe you talk about privacy, right? Masks can be fashionable. Masks give you some privacy. And for my final example, masks give you safety. Now I'm going to use this example probably a lot over these videos, so just bear with me, okay? Substitute whatever details you have for in this essay. Whatever essay you're writing, substitute your own details in, okay? Give me some information about something in your thesis statement. In this case, our details are going to be about the masks, and they're going to tell you what you can use them for. So I might write something like, we should wear masks. And then if I'm going to expand my details, I might say something like, masks can, first off, we have our, we should wear masks. Then we have, masks can be used as a fashion accessory. Masks can be used to increase your personal privacy by obscuring your face. And finally, masks can be used to protect you and increase your safety when in regards to diseases, right? Give some context, some background information. You always want to give some background and what we call context into your introduction. That's the official word for it, by the way. It's context. Then, number 1. You have 3, you have 2. Now we have number 1. Number 1, you're going to give me a broad statement. You always want to give a broad statement, number 1. This broad statement, I encourage to be in the form of a question or in the form of a fact. So we're basically going from the most specific in your thesis, okay? Then you go a little bit less specific, a little broader, and just talking generally about masks, what you can use them for, why they're good, why they're important. And then finally, you give a broad statement. This is as broad as you can get, as less developed, as the least developed that you can talk about in your introduction. You want to give something general. In this case, choose a general statement about your thesis. In this case, okay, wearing masks. I might say something really broad, like, starting in 2020, masks began being worn, or masks began to be a common accessory for people during the pandemic. Easy as that. Very, very broad statement. In this case, writing a general statement about masks in the pandemic. Because obviously, when are we going to wear masks? Only during the pandemic. That's the only time we've, brought them up. So we have our thesis, the most specific that we can get. We have our context, giving some broad general information about masks in general, right? And then we have a very broad statement, okay? We just have a general fact about masks and the pandemic. We started using them in 2020 because of the pandemic. Easy as that. Now we get to our introduction. This is an introduction, even though it doesn't look like it. In fact, there's a reason we did 3, 2, and 1. That's because if you write your introduction in this way, right? If you have trouble with figuring out how to start your essay, this is how you start it. you start it with number 1. But if you can't figure out what your hook is going to be, your hook, your opening statement, right? However you start your essay, if you can't figure that out, this is the best way to get to that hook. You start with your thesis. That's the easiest thing to come up with, right? The very easiest thing to come up with is going to be your thesis statement. It's how you feel about it. Then it's a little bit easier after you do your thesis, it's easier to come up with some context about it, give some other information. And then finally, once you have your thesis done, you have your context in place, then you're like, okay, well, just how do I start this? You just give a fact about both of these combined. Make sense? This is actually the hardest part of it. Writing your hook is almost always the hardest part of an introduction, and that's why we lead up to it. That's why we write the hook last, okay? But if you rewrite this in a different order, okay? You rewrite this as, instead of 3, 2, 1, you rewrite it as 1, 2, 3, right? Starting in 2020, we began wearing masks. General statement. Then we give a little bit more context. Obviously, we've started mentioning masks, right? And we started mentioning the pandemic. I'll put in the pandemic as well. It's a very broad statement. Now we have to get a little more specific. We introduced masks, we introduced the pandemic. Now we got to explain what they're used for, okay? So now we'll go, okay, well, masks can be used for fashion, for increasing personal privacy, and for ensuring safety from viruses. We've given our context. We've given our broad statement, and now we've given the same context that we had before. We've just rewritten it. And then we finalize with our number 3. Okay? We should continue wearing masks during the pandemic. Here. So this together is an introductory paragraph altogether, right? So let's read it. Starting in 2020, we began wearing masks during the pandemic. Masks can be used for fashion, for increasing personal privacy, and for ensuring safety from viruses. We should continue wearing these masks during and through the pandemic. You notice how that just instantly became an introductory paragraph? Now, it's not very fancy. I would very much encourage that you make that context a little beefier. Put a little bit more information on each one of these. Make them their own sentences. Give more details, obviously. I don't think this is a very good hook. You probably want to make it an interesting fact, or talk about how we, generally talk about the masks a little bit more specifically. But this works. This absolutely works as an introduction for an essay on wearing masks. Does that make sense? So now we're going to kind of analyze a couple examples of this. If you wouldn't mind scrolling up.
This one?
Yep. Up a little more. Keep going, keep going. And down a little bit. There we go. Let me double check that you can read it. Yes, you can. All right. So here we have a bigger example. Here we have 2 paragraphs. One of them is a literary analysis paragraph from an argumentative essay. And then we have an informative essay. But both of them exhibit all 3 of our different steps of an introduction. And we'll find each one of them. So I'm going to read it through. Try and see while I'm reading it out loud. See if you can find the thesis statement. If you need to pause it, you can absolutely do that and look at this paragraph and read it. But I'll read it out loud. The population of China is 4 times bigger than the population of the United States. Is that a problem? Some say no. The American military alone could withstand any attempt to take over the country. Others say that, even if both countries retain their separate independence, China's size and ongoing growth are serious economic or political problems. If China can prove that communism is a valid form of government, then socialism could spread as it once did in the 1980s, undermining years of work negotiating democracy and ideals of independence around the world. In this argument, one author, Lois Lowry, is loud and clear in her novel The Giver. Communism will never be as utopian as it seems because it sacrifices too much individual freedom. Now, if you remember all the things we've said about thesis statements in the past, you'll remember that a thesis statement usually goes at the end of the paragraph, right? Almost always. And in this case, we're exactly the same. And we can double check this, by the way. We're looking for the main idea of this paragraph. You would be forgiven if you thought, oh, well, obviously this paragraph is going to be about China, right? It looks like this is going to be about China because they mention China a whole bunch. But read the entire thing. We have a section about China and the population of China. We have more about the American military and China. We have China's ongoing growth, China's communism, China's socialism, right? Continuing. But then we get down to here. In this argument, one author, Lois Lowry, is loud and clear in her novel The Giver, communism will never be as utopian as it seems. That has nothing to do with China, does it? So we know that this author, whoever's writing this, is using China's communism as an example of communism not working, and then segues into another bit of information about communism. This essay is about communism and about Lois Lowry's The Giver, the book, not about China. So, our main idea, where is it? Well, let's see. The last statement here, the last sentence, in this argument, one author, Lois Lowry, is loud and clear in her novel The Giver. Communism will never be as utopian as it seems because it sacrifices too much individual freedom. That, to me, seems like a very, very specific idea. So we can go ahead and underline it as our thesis statement. In this argument, one author, Lois Lowry, is loud and clear in her novel The Giver. Communism will never be as utopian as it seems because it sacrifices too much individual freedom. That's a very big sentence, and it's a very big thesis statement, but that's okay. Because remember, this entire essay is going to be about the novel. It's going to be about The Giver. So naturally, you're going to include that in the thesis statement, okay? All right, so that's number 3. We've done the thesis statement. Now, how about number 2? Let's go 3, 2, 1. Well, how do they do context? Well, they say, okay, we've introduced in the thesis statement, we've talked about communism. How in the heck are we going to introduce going into communism in The Giver? Well, what's the biggest user of which country is the biggest user of communism in the world right now? Naturally, that's going to be China. So obviously, all the context surrounding China is probably going to be the next place to go. So this person probably wrote this first. You can tell this has nothing to do with China. It doesn't mention China at all. It's very likely they wrote this first. They wrote the thesis first, and then they said, okay, how are we going to get to there? So they said, okay, we'll talk about China. So we have here talking about China and socialism. If China can prove that communism is a valid form of government, China's size and ongoing growth, blah, 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 blah. But we can start here. This statement here, China's size and ongoing growth has serious economic or political problems, right? Can prove that communism is a valid form of government. So this section, I think, right, this entire bracketed section here, I believe is our majority of our context. You could even say that it goes all the way through here. From this section here, all the way down to the thesis statement. That's the context. All of this is about China. All of this is about China's growth. All of it's about China's communism, right? Establishing, first of all, they have to go backwards. Establishing China's communism. They just did it here. They just talked about communism, so they're like, okay, we'll work backwards. We're introducing China as a user of communism. And then they say, okay, well, we've introduced communism in China. Well then, how do we introduce China by itself? Okay, let's give a fact about China by itself. And that is where we get our very broad statement. That's where we get our number 1. So we have our number 2, and then we have our number 1. Right up at the top here is just a very vague, very broad statement about China. Population of China is 4 times bigger than the population of the United States. Does that have anything to do with communism? No. Does that have anything to do with communism in the giver? No. But it introduces China. So that is how this person, this author, worked backwards. They started with communism in the giver. Then they said, how do we introduce communism? We talk about China. How do we introduce China? We talk about the size of China. Make sense? So that's how they built their essay. But if you go back down this way, from the top to the bottom, you'll notice something very peculiar. You'll notice that it gets from the broadest, right? The broadest section over here. And then it gets to the very specific down here. So the entire essay does this. And if you can't see it on the, if you can't see it on your video, I'll make it a little bit bigger. The entire paragraph does a funnel. You start with the broadest section up here, the least specific, and then you slowly narrow down. You start with, okay, we're talking broadly about a random fact about China. And then we're getting a little more specific. China has communism. Then we're getting a little bit more specific. China's a problem. It undermines democracy. Then we go into, okay, communism is the thing that undermines democracy, and here's what Lois Lowry has to say about it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I can't really hear your confirmation, but I hope it does. And that is how an introduction works. Now, I'm going to let you do the next one. Take a look at this other informative essay. I will first read it through. You can go ahead and find the thesis statement. Remember, it's usually the last sentence of the paragraph. We'll go through, I'll read it through, and then I'll let you pause the video, and then I'm going to identify the thesis, I'll identify the context, and I'll identify the hook. All right? Awesome. So hearing music is relaxing to many, but playing music has even more physical benefits than simply listening to it. Further, drumming has possibly the most advantages for your health. Percussionists, whether professionals or amateurs, experience an increase in endorphins, a decrease in the stress hormone cortisol, a regulation of the heartbeat, as well as physical movement and exercise. All of these physical reactions make drummers happier, calmer, and healthier people. And if done consistently over time, humans can reap the benefits even more. Drumming is widely considered to be a healthy activity due to its impacts on stress, relaxation, and exercise. All right, so I'm going to let you pause. Go ahead and on your screen, if you want to, see if you can figure out where the hook stops and the context begins. Find where the context stops and the thesis begins. Okay? See if you can narrow down the thesis, figure out where the context is, and then identify the hook at the top. Okay? I'll let you pause. 3, 2, 1. Pause now. All right, so I hope you paused. I hope you took that opportunity to identify everything. But I'm going to go ahead and go through it. Our thesis is at the very bottom here. Drumming is widely considered to be a healthy activity due to its impacts on stress, relaxation, and exercise. That's a very specific statement, and I'm going to go ahead and underline it. But why is that our thesis? Well, first of all, it's the most specific statement, or at least it's one of the most specific statements, and it sets up the entire essay. You'll notice that it has 3 things, right? It has stress, relaxation, and exercise. So we can be reasonably assured that this person, when they write their essay, it's going to have a paragraph on stress, it's going to have a paragraph on relaxation, and it's going to have a paragraph on exercise. Easy as that, right? And we can label it 1, 2, and 3 for our different body paragraphs. Now, I have a lot of people asking, why don't we have this statement as the context? Or even as the thesis? This statement is really big, right? And it's really specific. It has a lot of details in it. Further, drumming has possibly the most advantages for your health. Percussionists, whether professionals or amateurs, experience an increase in endorphins, that's 1. A decrease in the stress hormone cortisol, that's 2. A regulation of the heartbeat, that's 3. As well as physical movement and exercise, that's 4. Right? It sounds like this is going to be a 6-paragraph essay with an introduction, 4 bodies, and a conclusion. Well, why isn't it? We can take a look at it. Take a look at the potential paragraphs that you would pull from this, right? You have an increase in endorphins. Can you write an entire paragraph on an increase in endorphins? Maybe, but it's going to be very, very specific and probably have a lot of scientific data in it. A decrease in the stress hormone cortisol. That could be its own paragraph if you're in a scientific paper, but it's really, really specific, right? So specific. Then you have regulation of the heartbeat. That's a little less specific. Regulation of the heartbeat, what does that do for you? We don't know. We don't have enough information here, but we can assume that if somebody wrote an essay on it, they would explain how the regulation of the heartbeat helps. But it's still a little bit too specific for an introduction, right? It sounds like it's evidence. And then finally, physical movement and exercise. That is a gigantic topic, isn't it? How are you going to write one paragraph on each of these endorphins and cortisol, these tiny chemicals, right? And then a paragraph on regulation of the heartbeat, which is also really, really specific. And then you talk about all physical movement and exercise. In terms of medicine, right? These are really specific issues. And then physical movement and exercise, that's enormous. That creates all of these. It's not specific enough, right? It doesn't match the other ideas. And that's how we know, first of all, that this is not going to be the thesis statement, because there's a change in specificity. There's a change between these are really specific, that one's really not. So we know that that's not going to be our thesis statement. And it also helps that stress, relaxation, and exercise are 3 really broad topics right at the bottom here, right? Stress, relaxation, and exercise. Stress, you're talking about endorphins and you're talking about cortisol as your evidence. Relaxation, you're talking about regulation of the heartbeat. And finally, exercise, you're talking about physical movement and exercise. Make sense? So that's our thesis statement. That's how we identify it. Then, we have to figure out where the hook and the context is. Well, first of all, we're talking about drumming. Okay. Well, what do we know about drumming? We have a lot of things about drumming, right? All the way from further, drumming has possibly the most advantages, all the way down through. These are all the things that drumming is good for. They explain drumming. But even here, right? Why is drumming good? It makes drummers happier, calmer, and healthier people. And it's really good for all humans. Okay, well then let's get a little bit more context. How does it do that? By increasing endorphins, decreasing cortisol, regulating the heartbeat, and improving physical movement and exercise. That's how they do it. So they go from specific statement on drumming that makes a claim, right? And then we have a little bit more examples of why it's a good thing. And then we have specific things on how it's a good thing. And then we get a little bit less specific. Now, for our really broad statement, how are we going to do that? And I'll label this, by the way. We have section 3. Then we have this entire bracketed section, right? From here all the way to here is our section 2, right? And then we have our first sentence. We're talking about drumming. What is drumming? Drumming is the type of music, right? How do we introduce drumming? Well, we could just talk about music in general. Easy as that. And this is our really broad statement. Hearing music is relaxing to many, but playing music has even more physical benefits than simply listening to it. Easy as that. Really, really broad statement. And that functions as our hook. Our broad statement or question, we got one. And once again, you can see how we go from the most broad at the top, right? We narrow down a little bit more specific, give some more specific details, and then we point downwards towards our claim. We have our arrow pointing down. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope it does. I hope you're paying attention. Because now we get to talk about conclusions. And we are almost done. I know it's a lot of detail. And you can skip around however you need to. Okay? Essentially, this was an entire lesson given in class. So if you missed it in class, you're essentially getting the entire class. And if you don't remember the class, well, I'm covering everything again. So you are well and truly welcome to listen to the whole thing if you need it. Can you do me a favor and scroll down again? All the way. Keep going. Back to that open space. Down more. Down more. Down more. More.
Oh.
Right there. Awesome. So now we know how to do an introduction, right? To write an introduction easily and without any sort of pain, we can obviously go 3, 2, 1. We can write our thesis as a recap. We write our thesis, then we give our context, and then number 1, we give our hook. Now, that's all well and good. We know how to write an introduction, right? That's how you write an introduction easily, and then you flip it, okay? Proper order for an introduction is going to be one, 2, and 3, going down. You start with your hook, then you give your context, then you give your thesis at the end of the introduction. That's proper order, because you want to get an arrow from least specific to most specific details going into your body paragraphs. I like to say that it functions as a sort of arrow pointing at your body paragraphs, right? You have 1, 2, 3, and it points towards your body paragraphs. 1, 2, 3 body paragraphs, right? That's how an introduction essentially functions in a paper. You want it to point. You want it to get the most specific towards your body paragraphs. Now, how do we do a conclusion? Well, you want to do the same thing. You want a conclusion to point towards the body paragraphs. So if you have body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, body paragraph 3, and I'll label those body so you don't get confused. Right? Body paragraphs 1, 2, and 3. How do we point to them? Well, the conclusion is down here, right? Our conclusion is down here, so how do we point to it? Well, we have to go up, don't we? So if we have the narrowest part is our thesis, and the broadest part is our hook, well, we can just do the exact opposite of an introduction. I'll let you sit there and absorb that for a second. A conclusion is a flipped upside down introduction. Now, how does that look? Okay? We can go with our example from earlier, our example on masks, right? And I'll write those down. So if you need to screenshot this diagram, go ahead and do it. So, we're going to write our introduction and then we're going to write the conclusion for our mask essay. Okay, so we have our hook was we've been wearing masks during the pandemic. Again, not a good hook. You should not use we, you should not use the first person, but I'm just trying to get the point across. And then you give your context, number 2, right? We have fashion, we have privacy, and we have our safety. And then finally, number 3, we should continue to wear masks. That's our thesis. And I'll let you absorb that for a second if you need to see it. Okay? Number 1 is our very broad statement, very, very broad opening line, okay? It's a fact or it's a question. You can absolutely do a question. Have you been wearing a mask for the past year? Would totally work, okay? You can absolutely make that into a question. If you're one of the people that likes to start with a question, have at it. Not a bad idea at all. Then you have your context, right? One of the reasons why we should be continuing to wear masks is because they act as a fashion accessory. Another reason we should wear masks during the pandemic is for privacy's sake. Wearing a mask allows you to hide your face, hide your expressions, and therefore keep your personal emotions secret. Then you have safety, right? We should finally continue to wear masks because they increase personal safety from viruses such as the flu or COVID-19. Ultimately, we should continue to wear masks even after the pandemic has ended, right? Or whatever the thesis happens to be here. We have our introduction. Now, how do we flip this into a conclusion? How do we put this backwards? Well, we should go 3, 2, 1, right? So I'm going to rewrite all of these in a conclusion statement. First of all, we need our thesis, right? In conclusion, we should wear masks, right? We should keep wearing masks. Naturally, right? That starts off our thesis. And it starts off our conclusion, right? We just restate our thesis statement. Always start your conclusions by restating your thesis statement in some way. Then number 2, instead of context, right? Our context, we've already given it 1,000,000 times. So if we've already given it during our body paragraphs and during our introduction, we can call this summary, right? Going back over the context. In this case, we have fashion, privacy, and safety. You should restate your main body paragraph points. Whatever those happen to be, restate them as context there, as your summary. And then finally, you need a broad statement. Now, I don't like making this a question, personally. I just think you should have a broad statement in general. But since you're, instead of opening it, introducing, you need something that ends the sentence. You need a conclusion statement that ends it. I'm going to make sure for anyone screenshotting this, make sure you mark that this is how you write a conclusion, not an introduction. Okay? You need your broad statement. So in this case, I want something broad that finishes out all the ideas we've talked about. I'm going to say something along the lines of, as you can see, we should continue wearing masks because doing so will help contribute to a lasting and brighter future. You can get really broad, right? That's a really broad statement. Wearing masks is good for your overall personal health and your personal development as an individual. Awesome. Something like all of these reasons are reasons why masks are important in the pandemic society. Really broad statement. Doesn't really matter how you end your essay as long as it's a broad statement, okay? A lot of people like to talk about the future, right? They talk about future generations and the world to come, right? You don't have to get so melodramatic. You can just be simple about it, right? As long as it's a broad statement ending off your conclusion. All right, so we've talked about our thesis statements. We've talked about how to open up your essay, right? By answering the prompt in one sentence. We've talked about body idea generation. Coming from your thesis, pick things that support it, right? Pick up ideas that are related to it. If you can't figure out any of those, give details, right? We're talking about masks. If I can't think of a reason why we should continue to wear masks, just talk about the masks. Talking about the masks leads you to the fashion. It leads you to safety, and it leads you to that privacy, right? Things you can do with masks. It helps lead you to body paragraph ideas. Our introduction, remember, I'll redraw our diagram here. Remember, our introduction is pointing down at our essay, right? We want to do 1, 2, 3 where 1 is our hook, 2 is our context, and 3 is our thesis statement. Getting more and more specific, more and more close to our main argument that we're going to be talking about during the body paragraphs. Then, to finish off our conclusion, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to do 3, 2, 1. We want to restate our thesis. We want a summary of the main points we made. And then finally, we want another broad concluding statement. And you can even make it as a question as well. You can make it a rhetorical question if you really want to. And remember, our hook is going to be a fact or a question. And there we go. So that there is a summary that talks about the line between our introductions and our conclusions. Essentially, if you write an introduction and you're done with your introduction, you could probably write your conclusion immediately following that. That would not be the worst thing in the world. You could do that. You could write your introduction and your conclusion first, get them out of the way, and then tackle your body paragraphs, if you really want to. Doing that would ensure that the beginning and the end of your essay are consistent with each other. If you mirror your introduction and your conclusion over that line of the body paragraphs, you can make absolute certain that your point is consistent all the way through. And that talks about what we're going to talk about in stage 2, if you haven't watched that one yet. But stage 2, we're going to talk about focus and topic consistency, time management and patience, and how to deal with bad prompts. So keep on watching these. I'm going to post them as soon as I can make them. In this case, we have 2 made so far. I've recorded 2 of them. I've recorded number 1 and number 2. That is Friday and today, the 29th. All right. So tomorrow I'll be making number 3 and likely number 4. That is varying your sentence structure, repetition, comma rules, conventions, and transitions. Essentially, the very specific details of our writing. And then finally, evidence on number 4. That'll be what we talk about Thursday of this week. Skimming sources, reading speed, how do you read things quickly, how do you choose what evidence you're going to use, and how do you integrate it completely into your paper. All right. In that case, thanks for watching. I hope you learned a little bit. If you need to, keep watching the next ones as they come out, and best of luck on the FSA.